Hello, my name is Vajdon Sohaili. I'll be chairing the second session, the title of which is Social Relations. First, again, to thank Rebecca, the terrific team here at PMC, and everybody in the room and online that has attended. The format of the second session will be the same as the first. We will have three presenters, the first of whom will be remoting in, and the second two will be here in person, which is a treat. I will introduce all three of them in advance. We'll hear their presentations, and then at the end we'll do a Q&A, so please reserve your questions for the end. So today, first we will be beginning with Shaona Barik. And Shaona Barik is an assistant professor of English literature at Visva Bharati Santiniketan in India. Shaona Barik, her dissertation dealt with fascinating topics and the representations of the occult and the uncanny in colonial fictions about India. Although today, Shaona's presentation is titled Health, Hygiene, Sanitation in Colonial Bengal, Case Study of Windows from 1860 to 1920. After Shaona's presentation, we'll hear from Albie Faye. Albie is a recent graduate with first-class honors in history and sociology from the University of Manchester. Congratulations, Albie. His dissertation there explored the dynamics of urban unrest and its portrayal through photojournalism, and he focused specifically on the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the American Civil Rights Movement. His paper today is titled Through the Broken Glass, the Window as a Symbol of Social Unrest in Britain and Northern Ireland. And finally, we'll hear from Ellie Brown. Ellie Brown just is a PhD student at the University of Warwick, where her research examines the architectural design of the 1970s shopping centre in Britain. And as part of Ellie's research, she has worked with the 20th Century Society for a Midlands for Cities AHRC-funded placement to expand her research and looking at spaces of consumption in post-war Britain more generally. Today, Ellie's paper is titled The Window as Frame and Boundary in the Shopping Centre. And so, first of all, I will welcome Shaona Barik, who will speak to us about health, hygiene, sanitation in colonial Bengal. Thank you, Shaona.
Thank you very much for having me here. And it's actually an honor to be able to speak at the Paul Mellon Center. So I will first of all begin with a few anecdotes, and then as I sort of proceed with my paper, I will move on to some slides which I have. So I have conceived the idea of the paper. Mainly, I've been through certain memoirs and diaries of European Sahibs who came to Calcutta in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Apart from that, I have also looked at a few newspaper articles, mainly published during the latter half of the 19th century. So I will begin with the anecdotes. There's this European Sahib who in the 18th century in Calcutta, he's saying that it is extremely essential to undress while you are indoors, and because of the tropical heat, because of the lack of pankhas and glass windows. So he says that the only windows that he could see in Calcutta in the 18th century, they are mainly made of twisted cane. Another anecdote, this is William Hickey. Hickey is a lawyer who is here in Calcutta in the 18th century. And William Hickey says that, while talking about how the dimly lit streets of Calcutta and how dangerous it is to sort of move across these streets at night, he says that at least, he was going to a party. And while en route to a party, he scrapes his face against the wall of a particular house. And he says, thank goodness, this house lacks glass windows. So louvered windows was introduced in Calcutta by the Europeans, but a slight modification follows. That is, there were these wooden slats. Can you, somehow I'm not being able to share my screen. If someone can share my presentation, if that can be done. So louvered windows were introduced by the Europeans, as I said, and they were mainly horizontal wooden slats placed across these windows. And these windows were movable. So the louvers, the horizontal slats, wooden slats could be moved. And and actually the purpose was to admit light, air, and heat. They are popularly known as khorkhoris, which is a Bengali term. Khorkhori is because of the sound they emitted when they moved. So this is something, and glass windows is making its way in the elite households of Calcutta much later, which is possibly during the latter half of the 19th century, middle half of the 19th century that time. Now, to come to the sort of the health conditions of the Europeans, I went through the books by David Arnold and Theon Wilkinson's book on Two Monsoons. So, and there's this, and especially while doing my research work, the ghost stories that I went through. So there's a lot of account on how Europeans found it so difficult to endure the tropical heat, the climate, and incidents of heat stroke, intermittent fever, dysentery, cholera had claimed the lives of many. That got reported again and again. And the empire was losing out many of its men to the tropical heat of Calcutta. It was discovered that cholera spread rapidly in ill-ventilated barrack rooms, overcrowded bazaars, and streets. So climate, diseases, and concern for hygiene affected the spatial architectures of houses, hospitals, and of course, it had an impact on the windows, which I will come to. The Examiner, which is a periodical, the Examiner in June 1st, 1850 is reporting that the heat of Calcutta is so strong that it cannot be cooled by fanning, neither can it be cooled by dampening. And the bungalows, the British, the Europeans and the Britishers have the elite section, quote unquote. They are staying in bungalows in Calcutta. And the bungalows were mainly flat roofed with ample number of doors and windows for the circulation of air. So often there were windows on top of the walls of these houses to drive out hot air. The Missionary Herald reported in February 1st, 1881 that large number of doors and windows is necessary in the hot climate of Calcutta. And mostly throughout the day, these doors and windows are kept open. Thermantidotes were fitted into the windows of some European household, and the thermantidotes were incidentally made of locally sourced materials like mango wood. To enhance the cooling effect further, there were tatties made of khaskhas, a kind of a grass, so tatties made of khaskhas were often fitted onto these thermantidotes. So khaskhas not only added a cooling effect, but they were also naturally scented. So the air was perfumed with the help of khaskhas. Garden houses or, garden houses in the Garden Reach area of Calcutta. This is just near the riverside. So the garden houses were constructed accordingly. They were spaced apart to prevent the spread of diseases. And houses which were situated in areas in the vicinity of Calcutta, this was known as Hawa Bodol, or the change of air. So many people, to recuperate from serious bouts of illnesses, they went to these places. And so these zones or these areas like Joshidi, Giridi, Shimultala, these are, places situated in the vicinity of Calcutta. So the houses over there also had, wide windows. And as I said, they were spaced apart. Also, to escape from bouts of endemics and epidemics, people used to flee to these places. But then again, a few officers and elite section amongst the native could afford such luxuries. The condition in barracks, or the condition of the barrack soldiers, was quite different. They were often ill-ventilated and ill-positioned. The description of a barrack in Dinapur in India, which got published in Fraser's magazine in June 1864, it stated that barrack rooms are extremely small. They have doors on opposite sides and often no windows, although verandas exist. So tatties which were fitted onto windows, which can you please keep this slide onto this one? I will talk a bit about it. So tatties which were fit onto the windows was a rich man's forte, and the barrack soldiers could not afford tatties on the windows. So it is extremely important to look at the manner in which the intersection of race, class, and gender had an impact on the construction and the accessibility to windows. So I will provide a few examples. For instance, there's this Nobokrishno Dev's house in Shobha Bajar. So he's this wealthy elite native, And he has built his house in such a manner that the ground floor rooms surrounding the courtyard, so there's a courtyard, and the ground floor rooms, which are exterior rooms, had small windows. Small as in so these windows could admit a small amount of light. So invariably the rooms were dark. And these rooms were occupied by the servants of the household, and often they acted as storage spaces. The Ondor Mahal or the Zenana, which is the women's intimate quarters in a few native households, the Indian native elite households. So they had low ceilings with no outward facing windows, as a result of which such living quarters were usually damp and dark, making them a hotbed for diseases. So women staying in these places were often afflicted with diseases like tuberculosis, which was a common affair in those days. Madhusudhan Gupta, one of the first Indians to be trained in sciences of Western medicine in Medical College, Calcutta, was critical of the Atur Ghar, which is an indigenous sort of a room it's a kind of a birthing place. And he says that this is the most unhygienic place for postnatal care, as it was small, damp, ill ventilated with no windows. So as I pointed out, race, class and gender was actually affecting the construction of windows, and the people who could have access to these windows in a way. Now, to come to the barracks and military hospitals in India, it was said that fresh air and pure water were rarities. So two particular reports are coming up in 1864 and 63. One is by the Barrack and Hospital Improvement Commission, and the other one is the report is entitled Sanitary State of the Army in India. And both of these reports are in a way pointing out that the barrack and hospitals have frequently no glazed windows and only wooden shutters, as a result of which both barrack rooms and sick wards are dark, difficulty in ventilation, exposing the inmates to foul air, damp atmosphere. There is hardly light enough to perform surgical operation. And a lot of thrust is now being given on the importance of glazed windows. So Florence Nightingale, who has never visited India, but she's written a lot on how hospital construction can be improved in India, and mainly for the rescue of the military and the soldiers. So this is her book entitled Notes on Hospitals, which she's writing in 1864. She says that it is extremely important to have verandas, because in tropical climate you cannot do away with verandas for the circulation of air. But she advised against minimizing the size or the number of windows. She pointed out that doors and windows should be on opposite side. Ventilation should be ensured by sufficient number of louvered ventilating turrets carried straight from the ceiling, which was there apparently in a few of my slides. So these are, the previous ones or the next one. The picture of the Eden Hospital, yeah. So the ventilating turrets should actually come up from the ceiling of the wards for the circulation of air. And doors and windows, if possible, should be jalosied for increasing ventilation in still weather. Franz Oppard is writing his book Hospital, Infirmaries and Dispensaries in 1867, where he's saying that it's extremely important to have windows facing each other on opposite side. And he says that each bed should be placed between two windows, receiving light from both the windows. So if the number of windows are to be reduced, then wider windows should be constructed. He's also giving importance on square apertures in the ceiling of the ward, transoms, etc. So to talk about the colonial hospitals and how they were improving, I will give a few examples, like for instance, the leprosy asylum in Purulia, which is constructed in 1884. So they are now focusing on the importance of transom windows for proper ventilation and two-end windows, which one can still find in the hospitals of India, two-end wooden windows. And light, in order to lighten the center room, two-end windows are extremely important. The Rashapagla Asylum, which is founded in 1818, and this is a mental asylum meant for the European inmates as well as a few Indians. So often these mental asylums, beginning of the 19th century, they were small, ill-ventilated rooms, more like the cells of prison. The rooms had no windows, were overcrowded, hot and uncomfortable, and prison-like atmosphere was deliberately created to restrain the unruly behavior amongst the confined. But in the middle of the 19th century, spatial reorganization was thought of to create remoralizing effect on patients in mental asylums, and windows played a prominent role in such endeavors. Latticed windows were constructed on the posterior of rooms. Also, well-ventilated, airy buildings with windows at southern end of each apartment was created to admit fresh air. Brickwork lattices on lateral walls was made. So windows admitted light, air, and had a sense of space. It added on to a sense of space to the inmates of the asylum so that they did not feel claustrophobic. So often these verandas and the windows in hospitals were fitted with Venetian blinds to keep the air cool. So a lot of trust in the latter half of the 19th century was being given on the importance of pure and cool natural air. An artificial system of ventilation was being critiqued. It was said that the air is, if the air is natural, it is not only less sweet, if it is sweeter, and also people die less and operations are more successful than when things are, artificially ventilated. I will come to the slides now. So this is the slide of the Eden Hospital, which is a part of the medical college. This is a gynecology obstetrics department. This was found in 1882. Some of the structures from the beginning of the 19th century have been kept intact. For instance, you can see the two-end windows, and not only that, these are the wooden sort of slats fitted onto the louvered windows, which are movable. So I was talking about the louvered windows at the beginning. It also has, incidentally, the glass panes have been added later on. So it serves two purposes. One is you have the glazed windows, and the other is for the purpose of lighting. And the other one is, of course, the louvered windows, as you can see, with the wooden slats, where you can operate the air, ventilation can be facilitated. So this is, once again, in the medical college area. So you have the construction of the transoms and apertures, casements, as you can see, which was being given a lot of thrust on in the 19th century, and the existence of the louvered windows. But majority of these transoms have now been closed because of the system of air conditioning. But some structures are, still in existence. So, and also, as you can see on the right-hand side, the small aperture-like window-like structures, these were meant for the purpose of lighting. This is also one of the pictures taken in the medical college, where, as Florence Nightingale in Notes on Hospital points out, that louvered turrets should be constructed from the ceiling of the wards if possible. So you have the presence of those louvered turrets for the free circulation of air, and glass windows, which is a later addition. But as I said, some of the structures have survived, some have been preserved, and some of these structures actually adhere to what 19th century, the books were saying, like Florence Nightingale, Franz Opatz, what they were talking about, how hospitals can be restructured, the role of windows in them, what is its importance for the survival of the soldiers. So this is once again the picture of the tropical hospital annexed to the medical college, and you have the presence of these are box windows, and the ceiling, if you can look at the ceiling, these are wooden turrets to keep away the rain. Not only that, but also for the entry of light and air. These box windows have been kept intact, at least the wooden structures have been kept intact. Yeah, so this is the picture of the Woodburn block. And I also wanted to talk a bit about how cultural assimilation was happening. So Eastern and Western architectures were being fused. So Woodburn block is a part of the Presidency General Hospital, which is constructed in the latter of the 18th century with, with new constructions being added in the 19th century. And so these are basically harem windows and neoclassical architecture, which are being fused together. So just on top of these harem windows, you have the triangular pediments, which are so typical of neoclassical architecture. The Carmichael Hospital, this is what we know as the R.G. Kaur Hospital. And this is a picture from the beginning of the 20th century. So you see the presence of the louvered windows, the wooden louvered windows, the trellised, latticed ventilation, which is there. Also the arched doorways for the circulation of air. So this picture I thought of displaying at the beginning, so which in a way I will wrap up my lecture with these, I think, slides. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shaona. I will now welcome Albie, who will tell us about Through the Broken Glass, the window as symbol of social unrest in Britain and Northern Ireland.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks to all the organisers at the Paul Mellon Centre and their support in the event so far. It's a real honour to be here today for what is my first time speaking at a conference like this one. So without further ado, let's get into it. The image that sits behind the title on the slide here is important to my discussion today, although it was taken in Paris by Hungarian photographer André Kertész. Without the context of this photo, it appears we are viewing a city through a broken window, but is actually a cracked glass plane negative, which the photographer only rediscovered decades after the photo was taken. This emphasises the paradox of this paper, that the broken glass could also be that of a camera lens or other piece of camera apparatus. The paradox also shines light on the role of the photographer during conflict. They are not just a passive viewer, but a part of these histories themselves. They possess an ability to affect public perception and are also at risk of harm. With that in mind, this paper is as much about the different strands of photographic practice as it is about the photos of smashed, shattered, or boarded up windows in the context of modern British and Northern Irish history. To reference historian Daniel Yonder, scholars have long spoken about a culture of spectacular riot in which window breaking was endemic in British history. There lies a clear association between our conception of broken windows and criminal deviancy or urban decay. As in the race riots in British cities in the 1980s, smashed shop fronts and broken windows became some of the most prevalent symbols of the unrest. These images, often front and centre in press coverage, amplified the sense of urban chaos and disorder. They framed the events to resonate with a suburban middle-class audience and proposed there was a direct threat to public order. The focus on broken windows also contributed to a moral panic by simplifying the context of economic hardship and racial tension that caused the riots. With headlines like Riot of Death or Looting Blitz in Moss Side, narratives of fear and alienation are constructed. Photographs of shattered glass restrict what we can understand and, together with these headlines, affect public perception. So I've got two quotes up here. The first from Jean Moore and John Berger. When discussing their concept of the ambiguity of the image, they explain that there is a fundamental difference between photography and memory. Whereas remembered images are the residue of continuous experience, a photograph isolates the appearances of a disconnected instant. They go on to explain the relevance of captions and their effect on photography, explaining, and I quote, "For as soon as photographs are used with words, they produce together an effect of certainty, even of dogmatic assertion." With that in mind, this quote from Sontag invites us to challenge this dogmatic assertion to find the ultimate wisdom of the photograph, to find why visual themes like smashed and looted shopfront windows may have appeared across visual culture, or to just view them in all their honesty. In the case of the press, it is almost impossible to do that without assessing an image on its own, without interference, and stripping it down to its original. Stripped of their sensationalist headlines, photos of the Moss Side riots from the Manchester Evening News reveal a bit of a different story. These two photographs of looted shopfront windows have been removed from their journalistic context, an effect which normalises the photos which, although showing vandalism, seem far less dramatic than the ones found in situ on the first slide. Broken windows weren't the only visual tropes used to demonstrate social unrest during these instances, and the representations differed across forms of visual culture. Here, in Pogus Cesar's photo book on the Handsworth riots in 1985, the smashed window is that of a home, portraying a potential racial attack rather than the vandalism conveyed in the press. Surrounded by other visual themes which wouldn't have featured in the narrative, of political graffiti on the wall, or of filmmaker John Akomfra in the corner down there, our photographic history of social unrest is enlarged. These other examples from reflexive photo books published quite recently reframe the recurring imagery of windows as broken thresholds between the private and public, order and disorder, as even more poignant. It invites us to interrogate our own preconceptions of social unrest and to see these urban spaces as sites of contested histories rather than just purely symbolic of chaos. Now, moving on to Northern Ireland. It isn't just broken or shattered windows that are indicative of social tension and disorder. French photographer Gilles Perez's Whatever You Say, Say Nothing is a three-volume documentation of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland between 1969 and up until 1999. In his own words, it derives a totality in all its simultaneities, containing more than 1,000 pages and photographs of the period we know popular today as the Irish Troubles. His work shows that windows are intrinsically tied to this story of sectarian division, bricked up with people fleeing the conflict, whilst other properties and their windows were targeted. His work almost acts as a photographic memory of the Northern Irish conflict. Photographs of children playing in front of dilapidated buildings with glassless windows behind them sit alongside depictions of similar residential buildings, two-story terrace homes, but this time with teenagers and young adults hanging out of the windows. These photographs shine a light on growing up in a war zone, an unsafe and futile urban environment. In these examples, the window doesn't hold the same premise as it would in a safer place, and it could even be viewed as a sort of privilege. Got another quote here from Graham Dawson. With much of Perez's photographs taken in Northern Ireland's two biggest cities, Belfast and Derry, the latter arguably the nexus for the beginning years of the conflict in the late 60s and early 70s, windows belong to a city or place's built environment, its architecture, and when a region is affected by social or political division, this tension is embedded into its geography. Cultural historian Graham Dawson explains that the historic, political, and communal division is inscribed into both the physical and imaginative geography of the city. Returning to Perez's photos once again, his portrayal of windows is not limited to photographs of them boarded up or broken. Instead, the recurring imagery of windows guides Perez towards the totality of the conflict and towards an understanding of its geography and the geography of a contested place. He often photographed people in their homes, with a double-page spread on the left an intimate example of the banality of life within the home, whilst the one on the right is almost unsettling, giving the impression that someone could always be watching. Italian photojournalist Fulvio Grimaldi's two images here and their descriptions add another layer. They are bound to the political stance surrounding the publication of Blood on the Streets, a small booklet which Grimaldi wanted to produce quickly to tell the true story of Bloody Sunday. As he was taking the photograph on the left, soldiers shot up at him through the window 5 times. In this case, the window, typically a barrier that frames and protects, has been compromised. Grimaldi, as an observer, was no longer shielded from the outside world he wished to document. These photographs echo the emotions of surveillance and division evident in the other images, but it also humanizes, contextualizes, and rethinks the photographer's role during periods of social unrest. Now, moving on to some artistic photographic interpretations of the Northern Irish conflict, which also reimagined the stereotypical and mass-produced themes of the region's sectarian division. Windows remained a clear focal point through which this division and its consequences were explored and made sense of. These three photos are from Northern Irish visual artist Victor Sloan's series Moving Windows from 1985. Photographs he took as he drove around Northern Ireland as he normally would, capturing the monotonous and mundane life of the divided region. The duality of the window is significant here. It's a barrier and a frame from the outside world, reflecting on the region's fractured society and also on ideas of surveillance, the public and the private. The whole series is shot on autofocus, making the photos feel rushed, as if they weren't meant to be taking them. The way they've been printed too adds to this real sense of monotony, picturing a world both devoid of colour and emotion, but also contested. Although not wholly focused on the window in the sense that Sloan's series is, multidisciplinary artist Willie Doherty's image from 1990 invites us to consider the interchange between place, memory, and the unresolved tensions in the urban landscape of his hometown. God Has Not Failed Us is a commentary on the significance of Derry's built environment, capturing broken window panel plates on a rundown residential property alongside a divisive peace line border and castle parapet in the background. This is an embodiment of Dawson's quote on the physical and imaginative geography of the city, and shows that places of unrest are an active character in their own struggles. Lastly, the symbolism of the window in the Northern Irish context is also evidenced by photographic work outside of Britain and Northern Ireland. German photographer Claudio Hils's Red Land, Blue Land is a prime example, documenting a military training ground in Germany which actually replicated the urban landscape of Northern Ireland, with facades, cars, and corrugated tin houses, in an abandoned environment once designed to prepare soldiers for urban conflict. The window becomes a key motif, representing the perpetual uncertainty of warfare, where soldiers must anticipate threats from potential unseen figures watching through glass. Hill's stage scenes of urban warfare blur the lines between real and fake, but the imagery of the window keeps coming back, a powerful symbol of how fragile things are, a powerful symbol of surveillance, and the constant fear of what you can't see. Through press photography of shorter-lived issues, to documentary photography and now artistic interpretations of the Troubles, we have provided our own window of visual culture to view social division and our perception of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albie. I'd now like to welcome Ellie Brown, who will speak about the window as a frame and boundary in the shopping centre.
Hello, and thank you for all being here today, and thank you for a wonderful event put on by Paul Mellon Centre. I'm excited to be part of such a fascinating series of papers. And my paper is going to be quite different, I think, in theme to the two previous papers that we've had, but drawing on the similar kind of social aspects. So to start, this paper looks at the window as a protagonist in relation to the shopping centre. The shopping centre being an architectural form that's more associated with its lack of windows and its lack of natural light. And so I'm drawing upon aspects of my PhD thesis at Warwick, which looks at the shopping centre in Britain between the 60s to 80s, but mostly the 70s. And it really examines how architects, planners, and designers used an array of cultural, social, and design ideals to envision the shopping centre in new and imaginative ways. So, in contrast to the windowless complexes clad in concrete and brick that were more typical of the period, and are kind of probably some of the more the kinds of shopping centres that you might think of when you think of that as a typology. My thesis in this paper seeks to look at attempts to envision the shopping centre as integrated into the built environment and designed with citizens, not just consumers, in mind. So one shopping centre that epitomises that approach is the shopping building, now the Centre MK in Milton Keynes. And it was designed by Stuart Moscrop and Chris Woodward for the Newtown Development Corporation as kind of an architectural riposte to the Arndales of its day. So these are just some illustrations by Helmut Jacobi. But with its rectilinear steel frame and large plates of glass, natural light floods into the interior. And here the boundaries of inside and out were deliberately blurred. And when the shopping building first opened, doors were deliberately excluded in order to create a permeable glass-covered arcade. And so these architectural impressions by Jacobi capture a civic sensibility that the architects had in mind, in which shopping was imagined to occur alongside more leisurely activities. And as these illustrations show, the steel-framed glass facade creates a frame for carefully planned landscaping outside, with the trees in the courtyard visible. So luscious planting within the building's interior also reinforces this notion of permeability. And I've chosen this picture here where the trees are actually really young, but now they've grown to such an extent that they've kind of reached the heights of the arcades in places. But with the trees on both sides of the windowed facade, we again have this blurring of the distinction between the inside and the outside. And as you can see on the left here as well, where mirror glass was used along the side elevations of the building, foliage is again reflected back onto the building itself. The rooftop service roads of the shopping centre can also be seen from within the interior. And it's not the best photo, but if you can see on the image on the left behind the lamppost, there's a delivery truck passing over through the service roads at the top. And this was acted as a visible reminder of the operational processes of a shopping centre that are usually concealed and hidden away from view, in order to conceal sustain the illusion of the magic of the mall that you might get in a concrete complex. So the architect's intentions and the clear influence of the modernism of Mies van der Rohe was picked up upon in the contemporary reviews of the shopping building at the time. For some, the references to Mies were an ill-fated attempt to mask the commercial nature of the mall through modernist motifs. And as one architect who specialised in shopping centre design put it, quote, "I don't even think that one can blame or credit Mies or the modern movement with this phenomenon, or rather mania." But for others, like the architect John Winter, the building's Miesian glass skin was to be commended. As a shopping centre that referenced the architectural modernism of Mies, it also had a lot to answer for, in the critique of its critics than other shopping centres would have to answer to. So as Winter noted, quote, "No other shopping centre would one criticise at such a level. Milton Keynes has quite simply the most beautiful modern shopping centre in the world." So the shopping building was exceptional in this regard, but the scheme's architects were not alone in their pursuit of a permeable glass structure. And as this paper aims to show for the rest of my discussion here, I want to talk about some similar intentions and influences that can be evidenced in two unbuilt schemes for Nottingham and Cambridge. In Nottingham, a young architect, Peter Winchester, was tasked with designing a retail, residential and office complex on the site of the condemned Victoria Railway Station in 1964. Meanwhile, in the early 70s, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers were also commissioned to devise a shopping centre scheme for Cambridge, which they worked on concurrently to their winning design for the Centre Pompidou in Paris. So all three schemes eschewed the concrete curtain wall more typical of the shopping centre, and instead envisioned glass skin structures of a more permeable nature. And as in Milton Keynes, Winchester, Piano and Rogers drew upon architectural ideas, and their unbuilt schemes can be seen as attempts to coalesce diverse aims into the planning of a novel kind of commercial environment in the 1960s and 70s. These aims are demonstrated in Winchester's discussion of the Victoria Centre scheme, published in World Architecture 2, which was part of a short-lived annual edited by the architectural critic and photographer John Donnart. Winchester describes his intentions for the scheme, describing a, quote, gigantic gleaming complex, one enormous glass building in which, as a result of the transparency of the building, it would be possible to locate oneself easily and pleasantly within the huge organism at all times. And this is a very dramatic illustration of what he had in mind, but you can see from the illustrations of people at the bottom how vast this complex would be, building into the whole site of the former railway. So Winchester's expressionistic scheme drew on Mies's unbuilt glass skyscraper designs of the early 20s, as well as Paul Scheerbart's 1914 treatise Glass Architecture, which he would likely have known from Rayner Banham's influential Theory and Design of the First Machine Age, which was published in 1960 and which helped introduce an English-speaking audience to Scheerbart's work. Both Glass Architecture and Mies's unbuilt skyscrapers were radical in their utopian potential, with the notion of a glass-sheathed building then unparalleled. In referencing these ideas, Winchester's scheme for Nottingham was a clear attempt to use the shopping centre to reimagine movement, structure, and the materiality of the urban environment. Similar intentions can be evidenced by Piano and Rogers' unbuilt shopping centre for Cambridge. Like the Centre Pompidou, the architects envisioned a glass-clad framework with glazed circulation passages running up the facade. As with the shopping building in the Victoria Centre scheme, the visible presence of movement would frame the ecology of commercial operations that underpin the shopping centre. Meanwhile, the use of a barrel glass vaulted structure again recalls the permeable boundary, and it was envisioned by the architects as a way to, quote, create a series of interconnected covered and open spaces which link with the existing pedestrian movement pattern of the area and retains the scale of the city. I'll go back to this one quickly. So this was to be achieved by incorporating existing buildings within the area under a glass-covered arcade that would lead out onto green parkland at both ends of the shopping centre, which you can see here in one of Gordon Cullen's illustrations. So the use of glass to emphasise movement within permeable spaces in all three schemes demonstrates a clear link with the use of glass in 19th century models for commercial space, like the European Arcade, as well as Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace or his unbuilt scheme for a glass walkway in central London. But for the architects discussed here, glass was also conceived as an experiment in visibly removing the boundaries between the interior and the exterior, in the pursuit of a more nuanced commercial environment that situated consumption within the natural landscape and urban experience. By contrast, the emergence of the typical shopping mall saw the removal of glass as a window onto the exterior in order to emphasise the display window within the shopping environment and to focus the attention of shoppers away from any potential distractions. So in the context of the of overtly commercial requirements that underpinned the schemes for Nottingham and Cambridge in the 60s and 70s, both of the original designs were significantly scaled back. The Victoria Centre, which you can see here, was remodelled as a concrete complex that the late Elaine Harwood described as a Stygian gloom. In Cambridge, the shopping centre was shelved in 1976 and later redesigned by a more commercial architectural firm in the early 80s. So by looking at unbuilt schemes for shopping centres in Nottingham and Cambridge, it is clear that the shopping building in Milton Keynes was not as exceptional as its admirers and critics supposed. At a time when the mall could still be envisioned as something other than an impermeable fortress, Winchester, Piano and Rogers drew upon the expressionistic potential of glass to imagine something quite different. And as in the case of the shopping building in Milton Keynes attests, it is possible to let light and the outside world in without undoing the equilibrium of consumption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. If I could ask Albie and Ellie to join me up in front, and we'll get the Q&A started.
So, if there was going to be a riot in the Key shopping centre, I said, would it be an impressive riot? So much glass.
I think it definitely would.
And you guys can choose that as well.
Are they already gone?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's been a lot of stuff in the news recently about school kids kind of descending en masse in the shopping centre of Milton Keynes. So, and it does look quite spectacular from the photos, but no smashed glass.
Yeah, there were no examples of shopping centres in the photos I looked at, but I'm sure it would be it would definitely be a big one.
I was struck, just to build on that, I was struck at the images of a lot of the rioting that was often targeting, as it often does, storefronts. And so there is this sort of commercial or this commoditized quality, or, it's a risk to basically the commercial life of the city, in the same way that the shopping centers is kind of glorification of that life.
Thank you for another great set of papers. Ellie, you showed us in your presentation some historical kind of precedents for the shopping centre, which was really great. So my question is actually to Albie about historical precedents for your photographs, which were really, really interesting. And I just wondered if there was any kind of consciousness that you'd thought about that maybe the photographers had in terms of historical photos of broken windows. I'm thinking especially, I guess, of the infamous Kristallnacht, and whether you might want to put that in a bit more context for us.
Yeah, for sure. Good question. In terms of the photographers themselves, I'm not entirely sure if those are things they thought of when they took these photos of the window, but because it kept coming back up again, I'm sure subconsciously it probably was. For me, conducting this paper, it was definitely something I thought about in terms of Kristallnacht, but also loads of different stories. David Olusoga, he spoke of in Black Britain when he had to kind of hide away from his window because a brick was thrown through it. I remember thinking of that as well. So yeah.
I've got a question for Albie. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all three papers, brilliant insights. And I would like to know, when photographers take photos of riots and broken windows, I realized that these Café Royal books appear decades later. So could you let us know something about the time structure? Are these photos interesting for newspapers at the time when it's happening, and then later on in books? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of these photographers, the photographers differ from photographers that have their stuff in the news and ones that are more focused on their own kind of photographic practice. So Poga Cesar, for example, he took the photos of the Handsworth riots. Those wouldn't have been in newspapers. And a lot of newspapers had their own photographers who they would go out and pay them to get photos of certain events. There's lots of examples of photographers that did both. In Clive Limpkin, for example, he photographed the Battle of the Bogside, which is arguably the beginning moment of the Northern Irish Troubles. And so both his photos were in book form, but also in the press. So it kind of shows a bit of, a similarity there.
Okay, so this is actually not an online question. This is a Rebecca question. I guess I was struck, Albie, by some of the images that you showed. The police in their riot gear had these shields, but the shields were transparent and were essentially a window, and yet that window was protecting them in a way that the rest of the windows in all three of your papers, their very existence is exposing, and it is issues of privacy or safety. So in Albie's case, safety is a big part there. And Shaona, I imagine, can people see in? Is that an issue? How does that change? How does that work within different contexts. And then in the shopping center, we're used to the shop window as it's showing goods, but suddenly if it's showing the shopper, it's the same as when you pass by a gym and they have all the equipment right in the front window and you're like, who would ever want to exercise there? So I wondered if you've thought about these issues of exposure. I mean, obviously, from a health perspective, Shaona, talking about, you need that window for ventilation and maybe light and things like that. But what about people on the outside looking in, or the actual safety in the case of Albie, that you can't be by the window because, as you say, the photographer gets shot at. So I was curious if you guys could just respond to that idea of exposure and privacy. Whoever wants to.
I'm not sure if this is a direct answer to that question, but in terms of the riot shields kind of acting as another window, there was also a photograph I wanted to include but didn't have enough time to, by Philip Jones Griffiths, which is of a British soldier through a riot shield, but it almost looks much more like a window. It's quite scratched, but he's very close to the riot shield. And that, I guess, adds another level to that exposure and that idea there. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think in relation to the shopping centre, if you think of the Victoria Centre, which I used, the images of it actually as it was built as this concrete complex, the developer, part of the reason for getting rid of the glass is cost, because one of the arguments was that window cleaning would be too expensive. But also, I think the developer had this idea really taken from the American mall that the shopping center or the shopping mall was a kind of secluded environment away from the big bad world outside. So I think, that idea of having the glass, that's kind of, it's too exposing. It doesn't offer that protection that maybe just creating a really interiorized environment would.
Shaona, would you like to respond?
Yep. So this brings to my mind a particular shot from a film by Satyajit Ray, and this is a film titled Charulata. So there's a particular shot where this woman, Charu, who is peeping out of a louvered window. And apparently, as I spoke about how the Zenana and the women's quarter and how they did not have outward-facing windows, so apparently Charulata could actually look out of these louvered windows, but the wooden slats were placed in such a manner, they were suspended in such a manner that the outsider will not be able to look at the woman who is inside peeping at him. So the gaze of the outsider will not be able to penetrate inside. The windows were constructed in such a manner. So apparently this is the slide which I'm actually thinking of, that particular shot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those papers. And actually my question was somewhat stolen by Rebecca. It was going to be about social power and how the window distributes social power, and I was going to grill Albie on the broken window theory of crime. But instead I'm going to ask Ellie something that came to mind when you were showing your pictures of the trees inside of the shopping mall, and you used the phrase, bringing the outside in. But one thing that it made me think about is how the windows allow us to pretend that we've brought the outside in by planting a tree, because of course we know green life needs a whole host of non-human agents to keep going on and to keep being green life. So I suppose it's a dreaded comment rather than a question, but it's about problematizing whether or not the window allows us, or in that period of architectural history, to lean into the sort of pretense of bringing the outside in. And in fact, tapping back into my first question, it is a form of social control, particularly around the relationship between human and non-human life.
I think that's a really important point, because I think you have to see the shopping centre in Milton Keynes and the planting in the context of what they were doing more generally with landscaping the whole city. And I think what has happened in the years since the 50 years or so that the shopping centre's been there is that, these it's not a natural environment for these kinds of exotic plants, especially that they brought into the environment, and consequently a lot of the planting has been replaced with office plants, essentially, that are they still require human intervention and human maintenance, but to a much less degree. So yeah, it is that kind of definitely, yeah.
Perfect. I also have a question for Albie. Have you also thought about this subset of demonstration images in the context of other kinds of demonstration images? Is there some reason that the broken window images had a special currency compared to, I don't know, burning cars or images showing direct body-to-body contact between demonstrators? And is it the type of thing where once some of these images appear, does it feed back into modes of protest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are, of course, lots of other visual themes that occurred in the press, especially in those photos of 1980s Britain. I think why I picked up on the window so much is because it did occur a lot. I mean, there were also photos of burning cars and police kind of brutality as well, but in a much lesser extent. So I feel like there was a focus on showing vandalism, and that does link to the broken windows theory as well, which was a popular theory in sociology and criminology from, I think, 1982, which really kind of draws the lines between broken windows being an early sign of criminal kind of damage and deviancy. So yeah, I think that's why I picked up on it so much.
We have time for one more question. Right there. There's a microphone next to you.
Albie, you compared and contrasted Northern Ireland with the rest of Britain, but there's a specific context in Northern Ireland which doesn't apply in the rest of Britain. I mean, the riots in Britain took place in the most deprived areas, whereas Northern Ireland is one of the most heavily funded. Did you see any difference in the role of windows in the latter riots, for example, in Burnley, Bradford and Oldham in 2001, and for example, the riot in Los Ells, in which individuals were actually killed by the rioters, and also, of course, the more recent riots following the murder in Southport. Do you see any distinction, or do you think the role of the window is exactly the same in all of these unfortunate events?
Yeah, I guess why I used these two specific examples of the riots in Britain, but then also in Northern Ireland, was not necessarily as a comparison, but to show that the window as a symbol of social unrest differs across two very socio-political distinctive moments. I didn't really look at the photographs of broken windows from later rioting. My academic background is in history, so I was more looking at the sort of modern historical and photographic replications of those instincts and historical events. So I can't really answer that question, I'm afraid.
Perhaps it's future research. So thank you to all of you so much for these fascinating presentations.